You settle into your bed tonight, perhaps with the glow of your phone casting gentle shadows across your pillow, and you're about to embark on a journey that's older than most civilizations you can name. The air around you feels heavy with the weight of time itself, thick like the humid nights along the Nile River some 4,000 years ago. You probably won't make it through this day without falling asleep, and honestly, that's exactly what we're hoping for. Before we begin, if this gentle ramble through ancient Egypt helps you drift off, please give us a like. It helps more people find these sleepy historical adventures. Subscribe if you'd like more nights like this, where learning feels as comfortable as your favorite blanket. And in the comments, tell us where you are in the world right now and what time it is. There's something beautifully connecting about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, yet sharing this same moment of quiet curiosity. Now let's ease into tonight's journey, where the scent of fresh bread mingles with frankincense and the secrets of ancient bakers await your drowsy attention. You find yourself standing in the pre-dawn darkness of Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, around 2500 BCE. The air carries that particular coolness that comes just before sunrise, when the world feels suspended between night and day. Your bare feet touch packed earth that's still slightly damp from the Nile's recent flood, and somewhere in the distance, you hear the gentle lowing of cattle being led to pasture. The street before you is narrow, barely wide enough for two people to pass comfortably. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a European alley, except instead of cobblestones, you're walking on compressed mud and straw that's been trampled smooth by thousands of feet over countless seasons. The houses on either side rise like sleeping giants, their mud brick walls still radiating the faint warmth of yesterday's sun. You pause outside a particular dwelling, unremarkable except for the thin wisp of smoke already curling from its roof. This is the home of Keti, whose name means he who takes in ancient Egyptian. The what he takes, primarily, is grain and transforms it into something that will outlast empires. He's a baker, but not the cheerful, flour-dusted figure you might imagine from a modern bakery. In ancient Egypt, bakers held a position of profound responsibility, almost sacred in nature, because bread wasn't just food, it was currency, offering, and the very foundation of civilization itself. The major historical fact that would surprise most people is that Egyptian bakers were so valued that they were often buried with detailed bread recipes carved into their tomb walls, ensuring they could continue their craft in the afterlife. These weren't simple instructions like mix flour and water. They were complex formulas that included specific measurements, timing, and even prayers to be recited during the baking process. As you stand in this ancient dawn, breathing air that tastes faintly of dust and distant water, you witness something that historians still debate, whether the Egyptians invented leavened bread by accident or through careful experimentation. Some scholars argue it happened when wild yeast naturally fermented dough that was left out too long, basically the ancient equivalent of forgetting your sourdough starter and discovering it had become something magical. The obscure cultural detail that makes this moment even more fascinating is that Egyptian bakers had a peculiar superstition about never letting their ovens go completely cold. They believed that the fire spirits who helped bread rise would abandon an oven that grew too cold, so they maintained a continuous low flame, sometimes for decades. It was like keeping a pilot light burning, except the consequences of letting it die weren't just inconvenience, they were spiritual catastrophe. You hear the soft shuffle of sandaled feet approaching, and you realize that Keti is beginning his day just as his father did and his father before him. In a world where most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, the baker's craft was anchor and legacy, passed down through generations like a sacred trust.
The wooden door creaks open with a sound like old bones stretching, and you follow Keti into his workspace. The interior is darker than you expected, lit only by the orange glow of banked coals in the corner oven. Your eyes adjust slowly, like an old camera focusing, and gradually the room reveals itself to be larger than the narrow street entrance suggested, a common architectural trick in ancient Memphis, where space was precious but privacy was priceless. The air inside is warm and yeasty, with undertones of something you can't quite identify until you realize it's the accumulated scent of thousands of loaves baked in this same space. It's the olfactory equivalent of a well-loved library, except instead of old books, you're surrounded by the ghosts of ancient carbohydrates. Ketty moves with the practiced efficiency of someone who could perform his morning routine blindfolded. He's a man of perhaps 40 years, though the exact age is hard to determine. Ancient Egyptians aged differently than we do, weathered by sun and physical labor, but also sustained by a diet that, while simple, was remarkably nutritious. His hands are permanently stained with flour and ash, and when he speaks, it's in the measured cadence of someone who's learned that bread, like wisdom, cannot be rushed. You watch as he approaches a series of large ceramic jars, each sealed with wax and marked with hieroglyphic symbols that serve as his filing system. These containers hold his most precious possessions, not gold or jewels, but carefully maintained sourdough starters, some of which have been alive and bubbling for generations. The major historical fact here is that these ancient bakers were considered so valuable that they were often included in inheritance documents, passed down from father to son with the same legal formality as land or livestock. Ketty selects one particular jar with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics. The starter inside is thick and aromatic, alive with wild yeasts captured from the Nile Delta's unique environment. Historians still debate whether these ancient bakers understood the science behind fermentation, but watching Ketty work, you suspect they knew something more important than science. They knew magic. The obscure cultural tidbit that makes this moment particularly fascinating is that Egyptian bakers had a tradition of naming their sourdough starters, often after deceased relatives. Ketty's starter is called Grandmother Nefret, and he speaks to it softly as he feeds it fresh flour and water, maintaining a conversation that has continued unbroken for decades. It's like having a pet that lives forever, except this pet helps you make bread that could feed a pharaoh. As Ketty begins measuring grain with a bronze scale that looks suspiciously like it was calibrated by someone with a very different understanding of precision than modern bakers, you notice something that would make any contemporary food safety inspector faint. He tastes everything. The flour, the water, even the starter. Each element is sampled with the focused attention of a wine sommelier, because in a world without chemical analysis, your tongue was your laboratory. The grinding stone in the corner tells its own story of labor and dedication. Unlike the massive commercial mills that would come later, this is a personal-sized quern, operated by hand and requiring genuine muscle to produce flour fine enough for the pharaoh's table. You can almost feel the repetitive motion in your own shoulders as you imagine the countless hours spent turning grain into powder one rotation at a time. The oven itself is a marvel of ancient engineering, a domed clay structure that retains heat with remarkable efficiency. Ketty feeds it carefully selected pieces of dried palm fronds and acacia wood, materials chosen not just for their burning properties, but for the subtle flavors they impart to the bread. It's the ancient equivalent of choosing between gas and charcoal for your barbecue, except the stakes were considerably higher when your bread might be destined for a temple offering. As the first pale light of dawn begins to filter through the small window, you realize you're witnessing the beginning of a process that will continue uninterrupted until sunset, producing loaves that will feed everyone from field workers to nobles, each batch crafted with the same meticulous attention to detail that has kept this family's reputation intact for generations.
The morning light grows stronger, filtering through the small window like honey poured slowly from a jar, and you watch Ketty begin the ancient dance of bread making. His movements are deliberate, almost ritualistic, as he measures water from a clay pitcher that bears the faint residue of countless previous bakings. The water itself tells a story, drawn from the Nile before dawn when the river runs clearest and the spirits of the water are said to be most cooperative.
You notice that Ketty doesn't simply dump ingredients together like someone making a midnight snack. Instead, he follows a sequence that seems almost ceremonial, adding each component while muttering what sounds like a prayer, but might just be the ancient equivalent of talking to yourself while cooking. The major historical fact that emerges from watching this process is that Egyptian bread recipes were often encoded with religious significance. Specific ratios of ingredients corresponded to sacred numbers, and the timing of each step aligned with the movement of celestial bodies. The flour he uses isn't the refined white powder you might expect from modern bakeries. This is emmer wheat, ground to a consistency that would make contemporary bakers weep. It's coarse, slightly gritty, and contains enough hull fragments to remind you that grain doesn't naturally come pre-processed. Yet there's something deeply satisfying about watching Ketty work with this imperfect ingredient, transforming it through skill and patience into something that will sustain life. As he kneads the dough, you can see the muscles in his forearms working like cables under his skin. This isn't the gentle folding motion of modern artisanal baking. This is serious physical labor, the kind that builds the sort of practical strength that comes from doing the same demanding task every day for decades. The dough itself seems almost alive under his hands, responding to his touch with the familiarity of an old friendship. The obscure cultural detail that makes this scene particularly fascinating is that Egyptian bakers believed the quality of bread was directly influenced by the baker's emotional state while kneading. A baker who was angry or sad would produce inferior loaves. So Ketty maintains a steady stream of cheerful conversation with his dough, telling it stories about the day ahead and the people who will eat it. It's like ancient therapy, except the patient is gluten and the cure is carbohydrates. Historians still debate whether the Egyptians understood the chemical processes behind bread making, but watching Ketty work suggests they grasped something more fundamental: the relationship between patience, rhythm, and transformation. He doesn't check a clock because there are no clocks. Instead, he reads the dough like a book, understanding its needs through texture and appearance. The workshop begins to warm as the oven reaches its optimal temperature, and you feel the heat radiating from the clay dome like a gentle furnace. Ketty tests the temperature by tossing a handful of flour onto the oven floor. If it browns too quickly, he waits. If it doesn't brown at all, he adds more fuel. It's a system that requires intuition rather than instruments, the kind of knowledge that can't be taught from a textbook but must be absorbed through years of observation and practice. You watch as he shapes the first loaves of the day, his hands moving with the unconscious precision of someone who has performed this action thousands of times. Each loaf is slightly different, not because of carelessness, but because handmade bread carries the subtle signature of its maker, like fingerprints pressed into dough.
The sun climbs higher, casting longer shadows through the workshop, and you begin to understand that what you're witnessing isn't just bread making. It's a form of ancient technology that predates the wheel, writing, and most of what we consider civilization. Ketty slides the first batch of loaves into the oven using a long wooden paddle, and the sizzle as dough meets hot clay sounds like a gentle applause, welcoming each loaf into existence. The major historical fact that becomes apparent as you watch this process is that Egyptian bakers were among the first people in human history to standardize food production. They developed consistent measurements, reliable techniques, and quality control methods that ensured bread made in Memphis would taste essentially the same as bread made in Thebes, hundreds of miles to the south. This standardization was crucial for feeding the massive workforce that built the pyramids. Imagine trying to coordinate meals for thousands of workers without some form of culinary consistency.
While the bread bakes, Ketty begins preparing the next batch, and you notice something that would seem familiar to any modern baker. He's always thinking several steps ahead. The sourdough starter needs feeding, the next day's grain requires soaking, and the oven temperature must be maintained at just the right level. It's like watching someone play chess, except the pieces are ingredients and the board is time itself. The workshop fills with the aroma of baking bread, a smell so fundamental to human civilization that it triggers something primal in your brain. The recognition that this scent has meant safety, sustenance, and home for thousands of years. You breathe it in deeply, and for a moment, the distance between ancient Egypt and your own time seems to collapse entirely. The obscure cultural detail that emerges during this quiet waiting period is that Egyptian bakers had a complex system of bread divination. They believed that the way loaves cracked while baking could predict everything from the weather to the pharaoh's health. Ketty periodically peers into the oven, not just checking for doneness, but reading the patterns formed by expanding dough, like a fortune teller reading tea leaves. As the first loaves finish baking, Ketty removes them with practiced efficiency, setting them on wooden racks to cool. The bread doesn't look like the perfect, uniform loaves you might find in a modern grocery store. These are rustic, slightly irregular, with crusts that range from golden to deep brown. But there's something deeply appealing about their imperfection, a reminder that food was once made by human hands rather than machines. You watch as he breaks open one of the loaves to check its interior, and the steam that escapes carries with it the essence of ancient grain, wild yeast, and wood smoke. The crumb is dense but not heavy, with a texture that speaks of nutrition rather than mere calories. This bread was designed to sustain people through long days of physical labor, to provide not just energy, but the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from eating something real. Historians still debate whether ancient Egyptian bread was actually nutritious by modern standards. But watching Ketty work, you suspect the question misses the point. This bread wasn't just food, it was culture, economy, and identity baked into edible form. It represented the transformation of wild grass into civilization, the alchemy of turning simple ingredients into something that could feed an empire. As the morning progresses and more loaves emerge from the oven, you begin to see the rhythm that will define Ketty's entire day. It's a cycle as reliable as the Nile's flood, as predictable as the sun's journey across the sky, and as essential to Egyptian life as the river itself. Each loaf represents not just a meal, but a link in an unbroken chain stretching back to the very beginning of agriculture, when humans first discovered that grain plus water plus heat could equal survival.
The morning sun now streams through the workshop with the confidence of someone who knows they own the place, and you find yourself settling into the hypnotic rhythm of Ketty's work. The sound of his wooden paddle scraping against clay has become as regular as a heartbeat, punctuated by the soft thud of fresh dough being shaped and the occasional crackle from the oven as wood shifts and burns. You notice that Ketty isn't working alone. A young boy, perhaps 12 years old, appears at the doorway like a shadow gaining substance. This is Amenhotep, Ketty's eldest son, whose name means Amen is satisfied, and who will someday inherit not just this workshop, but the accumulated knowledge of generations. The major historical fact that becomes clear as you watch their interaction is that Egyptian baking guilds operated on a strict apprenticeship system that could span decades. A master baker's training began in childhood and wasn't considered complete until the apprentice could successfully manage every aspect of production, from grain selection to final sale. Amenhotep moves through the workshop with the careful attention of someone who knows that every gesture is being evaluated. He feeds the fire with precisely the right amount of fuel,
neither too much nor too little. And you can see Keti watching from the corner of his eye, ready to correct, but hoping not to need to. It's the ancient equivalent of teaching someone to drive, equal parts patience, terror, and faith in the learning process. The obscure cultural detail that emerges as you observe this father-son dynamic is that Egyptian bakers believed bread-making skills could only be properly transmitted during specific phases of the moon. Amenhotep's formal training began during a new moon 3 years ago, and certain advanced techniques will only be taught during the full moon, when the yeast spirits are said to be most receptive to new partnerships. It's like having a cosmic curriculum, where celestial bodies determine your class schedule. As the workshop grows warmer, you begin to notice the subtle social dynamics at play. Neighbors appear at the doorway. Not customers exactly, but members of a community where the baker serves as something between a craftsman and a priest. They bring their own grain to be transformed, sometimes adding honey or dates for special occasions, creating a collaborative relationship that's part commerce, part ritual. Historians still debate whether ancient Egyptian bakers operated more like modern businesses or religious institutions. But watching these interactions suggests the distinction might be meaningless. When your product is literally the staff of life, the line between sacred and secular becomes as thin as phyllo dough. You watch as an elderly woman named Henut arrives carrying a small clay jar filled with what appears to be precious oil. She speaks quietly with Keti, and you understand without translation that this is a special request, perhaps bread for a religious ceremony, or to mark a family celebration. The oil will be incorporated into a special batch, creating loaves that are richer, more flavorful, and significantly more expensive than the daily bread that feeds the masses. The process of making this ceremonial bread reveals another layer of Keti's expertise. He handles the enriched dough differently, kneading it less vigorously to preserve the delicate texture that oil provides. His movements become even more deliberate, almost meditative, as if he understands that this bread will carry emotional weight beyond mere nutrition.
The workshop has now reached that perfect temperature where work becomes almost effortless, where the heat from the oven balances the coolness of the thick mud brick walls, creating an environment that seems designed by nature for the ancient art of bread making. You find yourself growing drowsy in this warmth, lulled by the repetitive sounds of production and the increasingly complex aromas that layer upon each other like invisible sediment. Keti begins working on what he calls his pharaoh bread, loaves destined for the royal household, made with flour so finely ground it resembles powder, and enriched with ingredients that most Egyptians will never taste. The major historical fact that emerges from watching this process is that ancient Egyptian bakeries operated on a strict caste system of bread quality. Coarse barley loaves for laborers, standard wheat bread for craftsmen, and increasingly refined versions for nobility, culminating in the almost cake-like creations reserved for royalty. The ingredients for pharaoh bread read like a treasure inventory. Flour ground from the finest wheat, filtered through linen cloth multiple times until it achieves an almost supernatural whiteness. Honey from sacred bees kept in temple apiaries, milk from cows that graze in specially blessed pastures, and spices imported from lands so distant their names sound like poetry. Watching Keti measure these precious ingredients is like observing someone handle liquid gold, each portion carefully weighed and considered. The obscure cultural detail that makes this process particularly fascinating is that Egyptian bakers believed the pharaoh's bread required the addition of water drawn from 7 different sources along the Nile, each collected at a specific time of day and blessed by a different priest. Keti keeps these waters in separate vessels, mixing them in proportions that follow a formula passed down through his family for generations. It's the ancient equivalent of a secret recipe, except the secret involves geography, theology, and hydrology in equal measure. As you watch him work with these premium ingredients, you notice that his entire demeanor changes.
The casual efficiency of making daily bread gives way to something approaching reverence. His hands move more slowly, his breathing becomes deeper, and he occasionally pauses to whisper what sound like prayers or incantations. This isn't just baking, it's participating in the divine order that keeps the kingdom functioning. Amenhotep observes from a respectful distance, understanding that he's witnessing techniques he won't be trusted to perform for years to come. The knowledge required to make pharaoh bread isn't just technical, it's spiritual, political, and deeply personal. A mistake in these loaves could mean more than lost ingredients. It could mean lost favor, lost livelihood, or, in extreme cases, lost life. Historians still debate whether the elaborate rituals surrounding royal bread making were genuine religious practices or sophisticated quality control measures. But watching Keting work suggests the distinction might be irrelevant. When your customer is considered a living god, every aspect of production becomes sacred by association. The dough for pharaoh bread behaves differently under Keting's hands. It's more elastic, more responsive, almost eager to be shaped. The enriching ingredients have transformed the basic wheat and water mixture into something that seems alive in a different way, more complex and demanding than the honest simplicity of daily bread. As he shapes these special loaves into forms that are more sculpture than sustenance, elaborate braids and spirals that will grace the royal table, you realize you're witnessing the intersection of art, craft, and devotion that defines the highest levels of ancient Egyptian culture. Each twist of dough represents not just skill, but loyalty, not just tradition, but innovation within carefully prescribed boundaries. The afternoon light begins to slant through the workshop window, casting longer shadows and reminding you that even in ancient Egypt, time moved forward with the same relentless patience it shows today, carrying bakers and pharaohs alike toward whatever tomorrow might bring.
The afternoon heat begins to press against the workshop walls like an insistent visitor, and you feel the temperature shift as the sun reaches its daily peak. Keti wipes his brow with the back of his flour-dusted hand, leaving a streak of white across his forehead that makes him look like he's been blessed by some benevolent grain deity. The rhythm of his work never falters, but you can sense the subtle adjustments he makes to accommodate the changing conditions. Less vigorous kneading to prevent the dough from overheating, more frequent checks of the oven temperature, and a general slowing that speaks to decades of experience working with the desert climate. The major historical fact that becomes apparent during this hottest part of the day is that ancient Egyptian bakers developed sophisticated techniques for managing fermentation in extreme heat. They discovered that bread dough could be controlled by adjusting not just ingredients and timing, but also location within the workshop. Cooler spots near the floor for slow fermentation, warmer areas near the oven for quick rising, and even underground storage chambers for maintaining starter cultures during the scorching summer months. You watch as Keti moves several bowls of rising dough to different positions around the room, like a chess master repositioning pieces for maximum strategic advantage. Each location has been chosen based on subtle variations in temperature and humidity that would be invisible to a casual observer, but are as obvious to him as road signs. It's the kind of environmental awareness that modern bakers, with their climate-controlled kitchens and digital thermometers, have largely forgotten. Amenhotep appears with a large amphora of water, struggling slightly under its weight, and you notice that even this simple task has been elevated to an art form. The water isn't just any water. It's been drawn from a specific section of the Nile at dawn, allowed to settle in clay vessels that impart their own subtle mineral flavors, and carried in containers that have been seasoned with years of use. The obscure cultural detail here is that Egyptian bakers believed different types of clay vessels would influence the personality of water, making it more or less suitable for different types of bread. As the afternoon progresses, you begin to see the full scope of Keti's operation.
This isn't just a single baker working alone. It's the hub of a small but complex network that includes grain suppliers, fuel gatherers, clay pot makers, and even specialized workers who do nothing but maintain the sourdough starters. The workshop operates like a medieval guild, except it predates medieval guilds by several thousand years. The social dynamics become more apparent as various people drift in and out of the workshop. There's Seneb, the grain merchant, who arrives with samples of wheat from different regions along the Nile, each with its own characteristics and price point. Watching Ketty evaluate these samples is like observing a wine tasting. He examines the color, feels the texture between his fingers, and even chews a few grains to assess their flavor and moisture content. Historians still debate whether ancient Egyptian bakers had access to standardized grain quality, but the evidence suggests they were remarkably sophisticated in their ability to assess and blend different wheat varieties to achieve consistent results. Ketty maintains mental notes about which grains work best for which types of bread, adjusting his recipes based on seasonal variations and regional differences that would challenge even modern food scientists. The afternoon also brings Kamwaset, the fuel supplier, whose job is more complex than you might imagine. Not all wood burns the same way, and different types of fuel impart different flavors to bread. Acacia wood burns hot and clean, perfect for the initial heating of the oven. Palm fronds provide steady, moderate heat, ideal for the long baking process. Date palm wood adds a subtle sweetness that enhances certain types of ceremonial bread. It's like having a sommelier for firewood, matching fuel to food with the precision of a master chef.
The workshop settles into its afternoon rhythm, and you find yourself mesmerized by the way Katie orchestrates multiple processes simultaneously. It's like watching a conductor manage an orchestra, except the instruments are ovens, dough, and time itself. And the music is the steady percussion of wooden paddles against clay, the soft whisper of rising dough, and the occasional pop and crackle of burning wood. The major historical fact that emerges during this period is that Egyptian bakeries were among the first businesses in human history to operate on what we would recognize as industrial scheduling principles. Katie doesn't just make bread randomly. He follows a complex production timeline that ensures fresh loaves are available throughout the day, with different types of bread finishing at staggered intervals to meet the varying demands of his customers. You watch as he pulls a batch of workers' bread from the oven, dense, nutritious loaves designed to sustain people through long days of physical labor. These are followed by the more refined bread destined for merchants and craftsmen. And finally, as the afternoon light begins to soften, the delicate pastries and sweetbreads that wealthy families will serve at their evening meals. The timing isn't accidental. Katie has calculated that laborers need their bread early, before the day's work begins. Merchants and craftsmen purchase their bread during the midday break. The wealthy send servants to collect their orders in the late afternoon, when the day's heat begins to subside, and the finest breads are at their peak of freshness. The obscure cultural detail that makes this scheduling even more impressive is that Egyptian bakers coordinated their production cycles with the religious calendar. Certain types of bread could only be made on specific days. Others were forbidden during particular festivals. And some required ingredients that were only available during certain seasons. Katie maintains a mental calendar that would challenge a modern project manager, tracking religious observances, seasonal availability, and customer preferences in a complex dance of supply and demand. As you observe this afternoon orchestration, you begin to appreciate that what you're witnessing isn't just bread making. It's early capitalism, sophisticated logistics, and social organization all wrapped up in the deceptively simple act of turning grain into food. The workshop operates like a small factory, complete with quality control, inventory management, and customer service protocols that wouldn't seem out of place in a modern business. Amenhotep continues his education by observing every detail, occasionally asking questions that reveal the depth of knowledge required to master this trade. When will he know if the dough has risen enough? How can he tell if the oven is too hot without burning his hand? Why does bread made on humid days behave differently than bread made during dry spells? Each question opens up entire areas of expertise that take years to fully understand. Historians still debate whether ancient Egyptian apprenticeships were as rigorous as medieval guild systems. But watching Amenhotep's careful attention to every detail suggests that the standards were extraordinarily high. A baker's reputation could sustain or destroy his family's livelihood for generations, so the knowledge transfer process was taken with deadly seriousness. The afternoon light streaming through the workshop window has taken on that golden quality that photographers love, and in this warm glow, you can see flour particles dancing in the air like tiny spirits, celebrating the transformation of grain into sustenance. The workshop has become a temple to the alchemy of bread making, where simple ingredients undergo their daily miracle of becoming something greater than the sum of their parts. As Katie shapes another batch of loaves, his hands moving with the unconscious precision of someone who has performed this action tens of thousands of times, you realize that you're witnessing a form of meditation in motion, work so perfectly integrated with the worker that the boundary between baker and bread, between craft and craftsman, seems to dissolve entirely in the warm, yeasty air.
The late afternoon brings a different energy to the workshop, as if the building itself is beginning to exhale after holding its breath through the heat of the day. You notice that Ketty's movements have taken on an almost ceremonial quality as he prepares for what is clearly the day's most important task, creating the bread that will be offered to the gods at tomorrow's temple ceremony. This isn't just baking, it's participating in the cosmic order that keeps the sun rising and the Nile flowing. The major historical fact that becomes apparent as you watch this sacred preparation is that Egyptian temple bread was required to be absolutely perfect, not just in taste and appearance, but in spiritual purity. Any loaf that cracked incorrectly, rose unevenly, or showed the slightest imperfection was considered unfit for divine consumption and had to be destroyed rather than sold. This meant that temple bakers operated under quality standards that would make modern food inspectors weep with admiration. Ketty begins by purifying himself, washing his hands and arms in water that has been blessed by temple priests and scented with frankincense. He changes into a clean linen tunic that has been stored in a cedar chest specifically for this purpose, transforming himself from craftsman to priest through the simple act of changing clothes. It's like watching someone put on a superhero costume, except the superpower is the ability to create bread worthy of immortal beings. The ingredients for temple bread are stored separately from everything else, kept in sealed containers that are opened only for this purpose. The flour has been ground from wheat grown in fields blessed by priests, sifted through linen cloth so fine it might have been woven by spiders, and stored in vessels that have never contained anything else. Even the water is special, collected from a sacred spring and carried in amphoras that have been consecrated specifically for religious use. The obscure cultural detail that makes this process particularly fascinating is that Egyptian temple bakers were required to hold their breath while shaping the sacred loaves, believing that human breath could contaminate the divine offering. Watching Ketty work in complete silence, his chest barely moving as he shapes each loaf with swift, economical movements, you realize you're witnessing a form of performance art that predates theater by millennia. Amenhotep observes from an even more respectful distance than usual, understanding that this knowledge is still years beyond his reach. The techniques for making temple bread aren't just complex,
They're sacred secrets that can only be transmitted after elaborate initiation ceremonies and years of proven dedication. It's like watching someone handle classified information, except the classification system is theological rather than political. As Keti works, you begin to understand that the temple bread serves multiple functions beyond mere religious observance. These loaves will be presented to the gods during tomorrow's ceremony, but afterward, they'll be distributed to temple workers, priests, and selected members of the community. It's an early form of social welfare disguised as religious practice, ensuring that even the poorest citizens receive high-quality nutrition on a regular basis. Historians still debate whether ancient Egyptian religious practices were primarily spiritual or socio-economic in nature, but watching this process suggests the question misses the point entirely. When your gods require the finest bread available, and that bread subsequently feeds the community, the distinction between sacred and secular becomes as meaningless as the difference between hunger and devotion. The temple loaves take shape under Keti's hands like sculptures emerging from clay, each one identical in size and proportion according to specifications that have remained unchanged for centuries. The precision required is extraordinary. These aren't rustic, artisanal loaves, but engineered food products that must meet exact standards of weight, dimension, and appearance.
The workshop grows quieter as evening approaches, and you can feel the day's heat beginning to dissipate through the thick mud brick walls. The light filtering through the window has taken on that soft, golden quality that makes everything look like it's been painted by a master artist who specializes in nostalgia. Keti moves with the measured pace of someone who knows that the day's most critical work is just beginning, even as his body shows the accumulated fatigue of 12 hours of continuous labor. The major historical fact that emerges during this evening preparation is that Egyptian bakers operated on a schedule that would horrify modern labor advocates, working from before dawn until well after sunset, 7 days a week, with breaks only during major religious festivals. Yet this wasn't exploitation, but necessity, because bread spoiled quickly in the desert heat, and the demand for fresh loaves was constant throughout the day. You watch as Keti begins preparing the overnight dough, batches that will ferment slowly through the cool night hours, developing complex flavors that can only be achieved through extended fermentation. This is bread making as time travel, where today's work creates tomorrow's sustenance through the patient alchemy of yeast and time. He adjusts the ratios slightly, adding less starter and more water to slow the fermentation process, creating dough that will be perfectly ready for shaping at dawn. The evening routine reveals another layer of Keti's expertise. He doesn't just make bread, he manages a complex biological system that includes multiple sourdough cultures, each maintained at different stages of activity. Some starters are fed daily for quick breads, others are maintained on weekly cycles for special occasions, and a few precious cultures are kept in a state of suspended animation, fed only monthly and reserved for the most important ceremonies. The obscure cultural detail that makes this evening ritual particularly fascinating is that Egyptian bakers believed their sourdough starters could predict the future. The way the cultures bubbled and rose supposedly indicated everything from next season's flood levels to the pharaoh's health. Keti examines each starter carefully, not just checking for signs of contamination, but reading the patterns of fermentation like a fortune teller reading tea leaves. As darkness begins to gather outside the workshop, Amenhotep lights oil lamps with the careful attention of someone who understands that fire is both tool and potential disaster. The flickering light transforms the workshop into something magical, casting dancing shadows that make the bread-making process look like an ancient ritual, which, you realize, it essentially is. The evening also brings Keti's wife, Nefertiti, whose name means
The beautiful one has come, and who manages the business side of the operation with the same precision her husband applies to bread making. She appears carrying wooden tablets covered with hieroglyphic notations, orders for tomorrow, payments received, debts owed, and the complex accounting that keeps the workshop profitable. Historians still debate whether ancient Egyptian women had significant economic power, but watching Nefertiti work suggests that successful bakeries were family enterprises, where gender roles were less important than competence. She knows as much about bread quality as her husband, can calculate prices and profits in her head, and maintains relationships with customers that span generations. The evening meal preparation begins, and you realize that even bakers must eat. But their dinner isn't just any bread. It's the day's experimental loaves, the slightly imperfect batches that didn't meet commercial standards, and the test recipes that Ketty uses to refine his techniques. It's like being a winemaker who drinks only the vintages that didn't quite work out. Except instead of disappointment, there's the satisfaction of learning from every mistake. As the family gathers around their simple wooden table, sharing bread that represents not just sustenance, but livelihood, legacy, and identity, you begin to understand that what you've been witnessing all day isn't just a job. It's a way of life so completely integrated with work that the boundaries between labor and living have dissolved entirely.
The evening meal unfolds with the quiet satisfaction of people who have earned their rest through honest labor, and you find yourself drawn into the intimate rhythm of a family whose entire existence revolves around the ancient alchemy of grain and fire. The bread they share isn't just food, it's a daily communion with their craft, each bite carrying the accumulated knowledge of generations. Nefertiti tears off pieces with the practiced efficiency of someone who has performed this action thousands of times, while Amenhotep chews thoughtfully, his young palate already trained to detect the subtle differences between batches. The major historical fact that emerges during this family meal is that Egyptian bakers were among the first people in human history to develop what we would recognize as quality control systems. Every loaf that didn't meet their standards became a learning opportunity, analyzed and discussed until the family understood exactly what had gone wrong and how to prevent it in the future. It was like having a daily performance review, except the reviewers were your own family and the stakes were your reputation in the community. As they eat, Ketty shares the day's observations with his son, which batches rose too quickly, how the afternoon heat affected the dough consistency, why the temple bread required an extra few minutes in the oven. This isn't just dinner conversation, it's the transmission of knowledge that can't be written down because it exists in the realm of intuition and experience. Amenhotep listens with the focused attention of someone who understands that his future depends on absorbing every detail. The obscure cultural detail that makes this evening ritual particularly touching is that Egyptian baking families maintained what they called memory bread, loaves made according to recipes that commemorated important family events. Tonight, Nefertiti produces a small, sweet bread made with honey and dates, baked according to a formula that celebrates the day Amenhotep took his first steps. It's like having edible photo albums, where taste becomes a vehicle for preserving family history. As the oil lamps flicker and cast dancing shadows on the workshop walls, you begin to see the space differently. During the day, it was a place of production and commerce. Now, in the gentle evening light, it reveals itself as something more intimate, a family sanctuary where work and life interweave so completely that the distinction becomes meaningless. The ovens that baked bread for pharaohs now radiate gentle warmth for a tired family, and the tools of trade become props in the quiet drama of domestic life. Historians still debate whether ancient Egyptian families experienced what we would recognize as work-life balance, but watching this evening's scene suggests the question itself might be anachronistic.
when your work is creating something essential to human survival, when your craft connects you to the divine, and when your family business spans generations, the modern concept of separating professional and personal life becomes as foreign as the idea of separating breathing from living. The conversation turns to tomorrow's challenges, a large order for a wealthy merchant's feast, the need to experiment with a new grain supplier, concerns about the approaching flood season and how it might affect their supply chain, but even these business discussions carry an undertone of excitement rather than anxiety, as if each challenge represents an opportunity to demonstrate mastery rather than a problem to be solved. As the evening progresses, you notice that the workshop never truly sleeps. The banked coals in the oven continue to glow softly, maintaining the minimal heat needed to keep the fire spirits happy. The overnight dough sits quietly fermenting, developing flavors that will emerge tomorrow as fresh bread. Even at rest, the bakery pulses with the slow rhythm of transformation, like a heart beating in the darkness.
The night deepens around the workshop like a comfortable blanket, and you find yourself settling into the peaceful rhythm of a household winding down after a day of productive labor. The oil lamps burn lower, casting softer shadows that transform the familiar workspace into something almost mystical. Outside, you can hear the distant sounds of Memphis settling into evening, dogs barking, children being called inside, the occasional clip-clop of donkey hooves on packed earth as late travelers make their way home. Ketty performs his evening ritual of checking the sourdough starters one final time, like a shepherd counting sheep before sleep. Each culture receives a gentle stir and a whispered word of encouragement, maintaining the relationship between baker and yeast that forms the foundation of his craft. The major historical fact that becomes apparent during this quiet ceremony is that Egyptian bakers were among the first people to understand that bread making was essentially a form of animal husbandry. They were raising and caring for living organisms that required attention, feeding, and respect. The starters respond to his touch with gentle bubbling sounds, like contented pets acknowledging their caretaker. Some cultures are more active than others, their fermentation patterns as individual as fingerprints, and Ketty reads these subtle differences with the expertise of someone who has spent decades learning to communicate with microorganisms. It's a conversation conducted in the language of bubbles and aroma, where the baker's intuition serves as translator between human intention and yeast behavior. Amenhotep helps his father cover the dough bowls with damp linen cloths, learning through repetition the precise amount of moisture needed to prevent the surface from drying while allowing the dough to breathe. Each cloth has been washed in water scented with specific herbs that supposedly encourage proper fermentation, though historians still debate whether these additions had any real effect or were simply comforting rituals that helped bakers feel more connected to their craft. The obscure cultural detail that emerges during this evening preparation is that Egyptian baking families believed their workshops were inhabited by benevolent spirits who helped guide the fermentation process. Before retiring each night, they would leave small offerings of bread and beer near the ovens, ensuring that these invisible assistants remained happy and cooperative. Watching Ketty place a small piece of bread on the oven ledge, you realize you're witnessing a tradition that bridges the gap between practical craft and spiritual practice. As the family prepares for sleep, the workshop takes on a different personality. The aggressive heat of the day gives way to gentle warmth. The urgent pace of production slows to the patient rhythm of fermentation, and the commercial space transforms into something more intimate and personal. The tools of trade become familiar objects in a family home, and the ovens that fed hundreds of people during the day now serve as a source of comfort for 3 tired individuals. Nefertiti extinguishes most of the oil lamps, leaving just enough light to navigate safely while maintaining the mysterious atmosphere that seems essential to proper bread making. The remaining flames flicker like tiny stars in the darkness, and their warm glow make the workshop feel like a cave where ancient humans first discovered the magic of controlled fire. The overnight dough sits quietly in its bowls, undergoing the slow transformation that will turn today's simple mixture of flour and water into tomorrow's sustenance. You can almost sense the microscopic drama taking place in each bowl. Millions of yeast cells consuming sugars and producing the carbon dioxide that will create the airy texture of fresh bread. It's like watching time-lapse photography of creation itself, except the process unfolds too slowly for human eyes to perceive. As the family settles onto their sleeping mats, arranged around the workshop so they can monitor the overnight fermentation, you realize that even their rest is integrated with their work. They sleep surrounded by the gentle sounds of bubbling dough and crackling coals, lulled by the same rhythms that have comforted baking families for thousands of years.
The deep hours of night settle over the workshop like a meditation, and you find yourself suspended in that timeless space where the boundary between sleeping and waking becomes as fluid as properly hydrated dough. The family breathes in the slow rhythm of exhausted workers, their rest earned through 12 hours of transforming grain into sustenance, their dreams probably filled with the endless cycle of kneading, shaping, and baking that defines their existence. The workshop itself seems to breathe with them, the overnight dough rising and falling in its own patient rhythm, the banked coals pulsing with gentle heat, the sourdough starters bubbling quietly in their ceramic homes. The major historical fact that emerges during these quiet hours is that ancient Egyptian bakeries never truly stopped working. They operated on a continuous cycle that spanned days, weeks, and seasons, with some fermentation processes taking so long that bread begun by one generation might be finished by the next. You can hear the subtle sounds of transformation taking place in the darkness, the almost inaudible whisper of expanding dough, the soft pop of gas bubbles forming and breaking, the gentle creak of wooden bowls adjusting to the pressure of rising bread. It's like listening to the workshop's dreams, where the day's labor continues in slow motion, guided by the patient intelligence of yeast and time. The overnight fermentation process reveals another layer of Ketty's expertise. He has calculated not just the ingredients and timing, but also the ambient temperature, humidity, and even the phase of the moon, all of which influence how the dough will behave during these crucial hours. It's a form of meteorology applied to bread making, where the baker must predict and adapt to conditions that change constantly, but follow patterns that can be learned through years of careful observation. The obscure cultural detail that makes these midnight hours particularly fascinating is that ancient Egyptian bakers believed the quality of overnight bread was influenced by the dreams of the sleeping baker. Nightmares would supposedly cause dough to collapse, while peaceful dreams encouraged proper rising. Watching Ketty's face in the gentle lamplight, relaxed and serene, you suspect his dreams are filled with golden loaves and satisfied customers. Historians still debate whether ancient Egyptians understood the science behind fermentation, but the evidence suggests they grasped something more important: the relationship between patience and transformation that lies at the heart of all meaningful work. They knew that some things cannot be rushed, that the best results come from allowing natural processes to unfold at their own pace,
and that the baker's job is not to control these processes, but to create the conditions where they can flourish. As the night progresses, you begin to understand what you're witnessing isn't just bread making, but a form of time travel. The techniques Ketty uses, the rhythms he follows, and the relationships he maintains with his ingredients connect him to an unbroken chain of bakers stretching back to the very beginning of agriculture. Each loaf he creates carries within it the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years, the distilled knowledge of countless bakers who faced the same challenges and discovered the same solutions. The workshop in darkness becomes a temple to continuity, where the ancient human partnership with grain and fire continues its eternal dance. The tools may be simple, the techniques may seem primitive, but the underlying principles, patience, attention, respect for natural processes, remain as relevant today as they were 4,000 years ago. In the gentle glow of the remaining oil lamp, you can see the overnight dough slowly expanding, pushing against the damp cloths that cover the bowls like sleeping children growing in their beds. Tomorrow, this patient fermentation will reward Ketty with bread that has depth and complexity impossible to achieve through quick methods, proving once again that the best things in life cannot be hurried.
The pre-dawn darkness holds the workshop in its gentle embrace, and you find yourself suspended in that magical hour when night begins its slow retreat, but day has not yet announced its arrival. The air carries a coolness that will soon be memory, and in this brief respite from the desert heat, the workshop feels like a sanctuary where time moves at the pace of rising dough rather than the urgent demands of commerce and survival. The overnight fermentation has worked its quiet magic, and you can see that the dough bowls now contain something transformed. What began yesterday as simple mixtures of flour and water have become complex, living ecosystems where millions of microorganisms have spent the night converting starches into sugars, sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide, and simple ingredients into the foundation of civilization itself. The major historical fact that emerges from observing this transformation is that ancient Egyptian bakers were essentially the world's first biotechnologists, managing complex biological processes without understanding the underlying science, but achieving results that would impress modern food scientists. Ketty stirs first, his internal clock calibrated by decades of early rising, and you watch as he moves through the darkness with the confident navigation of someone who could find his way around this workshop blindfolded. He checks the overnight dough with gentle touches, reading the texture and elasticity like a doctor taking a patient's pulse, understanding through fingertips what instruments might struggle to measure. The sourdough starters have been busy during the night, their surfaces now covered with the telltale bubbles that indicate healthy fermentation. Each culture has its own personality, some aggressive and fast-rising, others slow and contemplative, all of them contributing their unique characteristics to the day's bread. Ketty greets each starter like an old friend, stirring gently and inhaling the complex aromas that tell him everything he needs to know about their condition. The obscure cultural detail that makes this pre-dawn ritual particularly moving is that Egyptian bakers believed the hour before sunrise was when the bread spirits were most active, when the invisible forces that governed fermentation were most willing to cooperate with human intentions. Watching Ketty work in the gentle lamplight, moving with reverent efficiency through tasks that connect him to thousands of years of tradition, you can almost sense these benevolent presences guiding his hands.
As he begins to shape the overnight dough, you realize you're witnessing the culmination of yesterday's labor and the beginning of today's. The bread that emerges from his hands carries within it the patient work of time and yeast, the accumulated wisdom of generations, and the simple human desire to transform raw materials into something that nourishes both body and soul. Historians still debate whether ancient Egyptian bread making was primarily a craft or an art. But watching Keti work in these quiet pre-dawn hours suggests the distinction is meaningless. When your medium is living dough, when your tools are fire and time, and when your goal is creating something essential to human survival, the boundary between craft and art dissolves like salt in water. The shaped loaves rest on wooden boards, waiting for the oven to reach proper temperature, and in their patient stillness you can see the entire cycle of bread making compressed into a single moment. Yesterday's grain has become today's sustenance through the ancient alchemy of human skill and natural process, proving once again that the most profound transformations often happen so slowly that they're invisible to casual observation. As the first hint of dawn begins to lighten the eastern sky, visible through the workshop's small window, you realize that you've completed a full cycle. From yesterday's dawn, through the day's labor, the evening's rest, the night's fermentation, and back to the beginning of another day. It's like watching the wheel of time turn, except instead of abstract philosophy, you're witnessing the concrete reality of how humans have sustained themselves for millennia.
The first pale light of dawn filters through the workshop window like a gentle awakening, and you watch as Keti begins the final act of yesterday's bread-making drama. The overnight dough has reached perfect readiness, the oven has been coaxed back to proper temperature, and the workshop fills once again with the purposeful energy of creation. But there's something different about this morning light, something that makes you aware that you've witnessed not just a day in the life of an ancient baker, but a complete cycle of human endeavor that connects past and present in an unbroken chain of sustenance and tradition. The major historical fact that crystallizes as you observe this final baking session is that Egyptian bread recipes were considered so valuable that they were literally taken to the grave, carved into tomb walls, written on papyrus scrolls, and passed down through families like precious heirlooms. These weren't just instructions for making food, they were blueprints for survival, cultural identity, and connection to the divine preserved for eternity because ancient Egyptians understood that bread was the foundation upon which civilization itself was built. As Keti slides the overnight loaves into the oven, their surfaces already showing the complex patterns that long fermentation creates, you can smell the difference immediately. This bread carries aromas that speak of time and patience, deeper, more complex scents that layer upon each other like the harmonies in a well-composed song. The crust will be darker, the crumb more flavorful, the keeping quality superior to anything produced through quick methods. Amenhotep appears at his father's side, and you realize that what you've witnessed over the past day is not just bread-making, but education in its purest form. Knowledge transmitted through observation, practice, and the gradual accumulation of understanding that can only come through years of dedicated attention. The boy's questions have grown more sophisticated throughout the day, his observations more acute, his hands more confident as he assists with increasingly complex tasks. The obscure cultural detail that makes this morning's work particularly poignant is that Egyptian baking families believed the first loaf of each day should be broken and shared among all the workers, creating a daily communion that bonded them together and ensured the continued favor of the bread spirits. Watching Keti tear apart a still warm loaf and distribute pieces to his family, you witness a ritual that predates most organized religions but carries the same sense of sacred community.
Historians still debate whether ancient Egyptian society was more religious or practical in its orientation, but observing this simple morning ritual suggests the question misses the essential point. When your daily work involves transforming basic elements into something that sustains life, when your craft connects you to forces larger than individual existence, the distinction between sacred and secular becomes as meaningless as the difference between hunger and devotion. As the morning light grows stronger and the workshop prepares for another day of serving the community's need for fresh bread, you begin to understand that what you've witnessed is more than historical curiosity. It's a reminder of what work can be when it's aligned with human need, connected to tradition, and performed with the kind of attention that transforms simple tasks into expressions of care and competence. The bread that emerges from Ketty's oven this morning will feed laborers building monuments that will last for millennia, nourish children who will grow up to become the next generation of craftsmen and leaders, and provide sustenance for a civilization that understood something we're still learning, that the quality of daily work determines the quality of daily life, and that treating simple tasks with reverence and skill creates a foundation for human flourishing that no amount of technology can replace. Now, as the workshop fills with the golden light of a new day and the aroma of fresh bread mingles with the gentle warmth of banked coals, let yourself sink deeper into the comfortable knowledge that some things never change. The human need for nourishment, the satisfaction of work well done, and the quiet magic that happens when simple ingredients are transformed by patient hands into something that feeds both body and soul. The ancient rhythms of kneading and rising, of fire and fermentation, continue their eternal dance, carrying you gently toward whatever dreams await in the soft darkness of your own rest, where the gentle sounds of bubbling dough and crackling flames fade into the peaceful silence of deep, restorative sleep.